Hello, my name is Demian Willette, and I'm an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles, California. And today I'm sharing a bit about seagrasses ecosystems and their significance. And so the goal of today is really this high-level overview about seagrasses and what they mean in terms of their abilities, their capabilities, and how they relate to us in terms of humans and these ideas of ecosystem services. And lastly, where there's new opportunity as we move forward in thinking about seagrasses, and particularly in terms of this training training school and workshop. All right, so let's get started. So what are seagrasses? Well, seagrasses are a group of about 60 species of underwater marine flowering plants that reinvaded the seas about 100 million years ago. They're not horribly unlike the terrestrial grasses you see, like rye and bromus and things like that, which are pictured here on the left. And the seagrasses, an example, is pictured here on the right. The big distinction, of course, is that their whole life cycle is underwater, which makes all the difference in the world if you think about it. And here's where we can see how seagrasses have evolved, again, roughly 100 million years ago. We can see the phytoplankton. So from left to right, we're going through evolutionary time. Phytoplankton, the red, the brown, the green algae. We have the transition to land plants. And then seagrasses actually were part of this transition back into the sea. And some distinctions you're going to see here is that their substrate, in terms of what they live on, as before might have been hard substrates, here there's soft substrates. And this opens up opportunities of where they are found in the world. Importantly, seagrasses are not marine algae. What's pictured here on the left are two examples of seagrasses, okay? And on the right are things that look similar, but those are all marine algal species, all right? So these are different. There are differences in terms of seagrasses have true leaves, true stems, true roots, all of those things. Algae don't. They have blades and stipes and holdfasts. So there are some differences that we'll see as we move forward today. But if anything from today, seagrasses are not the same as marine algae. But what is amazing about them is the biodiversity that they support. They support large charismatic megafauna like manatees and dugongs or sea turtles that graze upon the seagrasses as a primary food source. We can have invertebrates, mollusks such as this conch that lives amongst these turtle grass blades I have pictured at the top right, or smaller mollusks such as snails. These are, sea slugs, which are beautiful in color and patterns and have this tremendous capability that are hiding amongst those leaves of seagrass. Fish. Of course, I could show you all sorts of types of fish that live in seagrass, but I like this one in particular, the seahorse, which is adapted to camouflage with those seagrass blades. And invertebrates such as octopus. I'm quite fond of octopus, as well as this species of seagrass that's behind it, which is an invasive species where I work down in the Caribbean. So what do seagrasses really do? What's their thing? What is it that they're providing? Well, I want to start with some clever traits of seagrasses. In particular, starting with this first point, that they photosynthesize underwater. So plants are brilliant at combining sunlight and carbon dioxide to produce sugars and oxygen, this classic equation you can see here in the middle of the screen of how that works. Yet that process is a little bit more complicated by how light behaves as it moves through the ocean. And so here you can see in the photo on the right, seagrass is down there, and that light has to make its way from the surface down to where these plants are sitting on the benthos. And as you're aware of, light penetrates ocean water in different ways. Here I'm showing you a picture of how deep that light goes in coastal waters, which is where most seagrasses occur. And that light might only get down to 50 meters. Additionally, the colors, okay, the types of light vary in terms of their wavelength at different depths. And so we lose the reds and the purples very early on, but it's the greens and the yellows that make it deeper. Well, on the right side of the image at the bottom, you can see that absorption spectrum of the different pigments. And seagrass use things like chlorophyll A and B and these pigments to make the most of the environment that they're in with the available light. They're also quite clever in terms of what they grow on. All right, I mentioned soft bottoms earlier, and this idea that most seagrasses thrive on soft bottom parts of the ocean. But quite literally, their home is moving underneath them. The substrate shifts and moves around, and it requires stabilization. How they achieve this are through several structures. One is a rhizome. This is a horizontal structure which runs across the surface or just below the surface of the sand. And if one part of the plant gets buried, the rhizome is an opportunity to expand laterally and grow a new shoot or new group of leaves. Additionally, they have roots. That's unique about plants, something different from algae. And those roots also give stability and structure. And over time, this can build up and you get this accretion of roots that give them even more stability. Another clever trait is their wide salinity tolerance. So like all plants, salt affects growth, distribution, and even they're resistant to different types of diseases. Seagrasses are in the sea. They're adapted to live in salt water, but they're also very flexible in that. They can live in salt water that's as low as 20 parts per thousand, or something as very hypersaline as 74 parts per thousand. This is quite impressive when you think about the average salinity of the ocean is about 30 to 35 parts per thousand. So much so that there's even a group, a genus of seagrass, Halophila, salt-loving. These ones are actually really adapted well for these hypersaline environments, such that we see in places like the Red Sea. And they also are clever in terms of the fact that you've taken a life cycle that is completed completely underwater. So these classic concepts of wind pollination or insect pollination don't work so well underneath the ocean because you don't have winds. You don't have bees and butterflies swimming around. Yet seagrass finds a way using an assortment of ways of moving those pollen grains around. So the top picture of the three that you see in the top kind of left, that is a flower, a beautiful flower of seagrass. It's kind of like an orchid. The bottom photo is showing you the fruiting bodies, and on the right, those are some of the seeds. And they look very much like other plant seeds. Interestingly, we're still discovering a lot about seagrass in terms that, you know, maybe there are some invertebrate fauna that do pollinate marine flowers, specifically seagrass. And so this is an area where we're just still even learning new things. We didn't think that pollination worked underwater in the same way. Well, it turns out there might be more similarities with the terrestrial world than we initially thought. And so what we see of these traits that are there that we've described and even other features influence where we find seagrasses across our planet. And so what you're looking at here is an image of our planet, a map, and we can see the colors. The darker the color of green is the more species of seagrass in an area. The numbers that you're seeing are regions around our planet. And so where this workshop is occurring in the Mediterranean, there's somewhere between 3 and 7 different species of seagrass that can be described here. Where we see the most, we can look to Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, the Coral Triangle. Okay, and we can see that's where we have this hotspot of seagrass biodiversity, much like we see with corals and reef fishes and mangroves. As we move away from there, what's more impressive about seagrasses is, unlike corals, that we can see still that diversity extending all the way to the polar regions. And you can find seagrasses up in Alaska and in around Iceland and so forth. So this is really interesting in seeing that although there's only 60 species of seagrass on the planet, we can find them everywhere, nearly everywhere. What's their importance ecologically? Well, we can look into a few of these different things. For example, one, they are plants. Okay, so they are a primary producer, and they're the base of the marine food web, being able to support fish and turtles and manatees and seabirds, as well as many other things. So base of the food web. Additionally, they are key nursery habitats. Juvenile coastal and reef fish utilize seagrass beds as this nursery ground. I have a master's student who has actually just defended her thesis, and we were looking at seagrass and the recruitment of yellow-tailed snapper. And we could see that just after the moon cycle, these juvenile fish recruit. Their first place of landing after being in the water column is the seagrass bed. And they'll spend the first couple months of their life there growing from just like a centimeter to up to 7 centimeters before they then transition it into other adjacent habitats, such as the mangroves and then the coral reefs and so forth. But it starts in the seagrass bed. And so those are just a few of their ecological services. What I want to think about is what their ecosystem services are. And again, this is a little bit more anthropogenic centric sort of tone to this, is how do they benefit us? So ecosystem services are defined as the benefits nature provides to us for free, and us being humans. And so you're likely familiar with this, but on the right, I have an image here. We can see the different types of ecosystem services. We categorize these into 4 large groups, including provisioning. So this is food and raw materials and medical resources and fresh water. Regulating, this is water regulation, water filtration, climate regulation. We can see supporting, this is photosynthesis and soil formation. And then lastly, cultural. And this is everything from recreation and ecotourism to mental health and physical health, aesthetic value, and of course, spiritual and religious value. And so these are the things that we're talking about. So how does seagrass fit into here? Well, in a diversity of ways. For one, I mentioned earlier this role of fish and invertebrate nursery. That's key at an ecological standpoint, but also little fish that recruit to the seagrass bed become larger fish, and a lot of those fish are what we eat. So they're supporting coastal fisheries in that way. So their ecosystem service there is in terms of provisioning and providing habitat. Shoreline stability, some seagrasses are just a few centimeters tall, others can be meters tall. And how does that influence the shoreline where a lot of humans like to live? Well, here's a little bit more about this. They achieve it through wave attenuation and sediment trapping. And so that kind of canopy of seagrass can slow water as it passes over the bed or through it. And this can entrap particles as they fall out. And so here's just a little quick animation. We can see down at the bottom, the green structures there, that's our seagrass. On the left are some ocean currents that are approaching a seagrass bed. As that water moves over the seagrass bed, it's transformed, it's changed in different ways. And so if we have these black particles at the left, above the seagrass bed, it floats by fairly quickly. The seagrass doesn't have an impact. As it gets closer to that interface, we see this interaction, this turbulence that then can cause some of these particles to settle out. But if that current hits the middle of the bed, they actually drop out much earlier. So they're pulling sediments out of the water column. But what they're also doing is changing the water as it passes. So that's that wave attenuation and calming it. There's also this really cool thing, a side note, is you know what a tsunami is, this movement of water, wave energy over the ocean after an earthquake or so forth. If you've ever hovered over a seagrass bed, you're floating on the surface and look down and you can see the waves moving back and forth and the grains moving. That's called actually a monami, is this kind of movement and the wave pattern of plants as they move back forward. You do it too long and you can get seasick, but that's just something we see out there. Other features that we're thinking in terms of seagrasses ecosystem services, carbon sequestration. Again, they're plants. They're trapping carbon dioxide. They're fixing it through photosynthesis and depositing it down in those sediments. And again, through their rhizomes that I showed you earlier, it can build up pretty substantial layers and trap a lot of that. So this has an impact in the atmosphere by what's pulled into the ocean water and being trapped as it's a kind of blue pump into the ocean of storing carbon. And it also has impacts in terms of ocean acidification, which is something related to the amount of carbon dioxide that's available. On the right, we can think of anti-fouling agents. If you've ever taken anything and put it into the ocean, like a boat, after a certain amount of time, the hull of the ship will get all these barnacles and organisms living on there. Well, seagrasses are a really appealing surface out there in the ocean. And indeed, sometimes organisms land on them. But a lot of seagrasses can also have strategies to mitigate that, this sort of anti-fouling agents that they use to keep their surface clean. Because if their surface is covered, they can't photosynthesize. If they can't photosynthesize, they die. So there's these opportunities for anti-fouling agents from seagrasses. We can also think of other services such as pharmaceuticals. There's some wonderful folks out there doing research in terms of seagrasses as a potential source for natural antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents. The picture at the bottom left here is of Halophila ovalis, that these compounds can be taken from and are being tested. So tremendous potential in terms of pharmaceuticals. And seagrasses are ecosystem engineers. So we can think about in the terrestrial world, so at the top there, you can see there's some houses and some paths and so forth that folks have constructed okay, our engineers have designed. But out there on the bottom half in the ocean, we can see in parallel with mangrove forests and coral reefs, seagrasses actually can shape what the ocean environment looks like and create opportunities and habitats for other organisms to survive. Okay, they are this grassland that's in the ocean, making the environment functional for many other species. I want to talk briefly about the worth. So I've talked about kind of their roles and what they can do in terms of ecosystem services. What's their worth? Well, valuation of ecosystem services is an idea. And so there's some pushback. What's the importance of giving a dollar sign to an ecosystem? Well, for some stakeholders, that's actually really important. If you're a coastal developer and you're deciding, should I build this marina along the coast, or should I transform this seagrass habitat from a seagrass bed into a shrimp farm, dollars do matter there. So some folks have definitely tackled this by valuing the worth of ecosystem services, including the paper shown at the bottom left is by Constanza. Constanza and his team have actually done a couple analysis on this. And so I want to draw your attention to this level here. We have marine biomes, and within there we can see seagrasses. They're also grouped with algae. Seagrasses aren't algae, but they're grouped in here. And what we can see is if you actually go to the right, they did a study in 97 and in 2011. And in 2011, we can see that value of 28,000, almost 29,000 US dollars per hectare per year. In the marine environment, that is the second highest, only to corals. If we look across all of the habitats, including those things that are in terrestrial, it's the third highest after tidal marsh and mangroves, which is where seagrasses actually grow. So some of that might be interchanged, coral reefs, and now seagrass. So they're very valued in terms of their worth. However, taking a look back up at the top left, where we see the area, there's not a lot of them. There's not a tremendous amount of hectares of seagrass on the planet, okay? And why is that? What are those drivers of seagrass loss? And so I'm going to show you some images here is that there's lots of ways. There's poor boating practices. So what you're seeing here is an image of a seagrass bed, and those scars are created by propellers that have ripped through this seagrass bed and create open spaces that then tear up the community. Then you can have waves that come in and actually make these scars larger and larger, and we get the erosion and loss of seagrass beds. We can have fishing, such as bottom trawling, which is what you're seeing here, is the trawl has come through the seagrass bed and ripped it up. You're also seeing the role of pollution. You can see the pollution, the litter and plastics that are throughout this bed. We can have poor management in terms of fish pens and aquaculture and runoff. This is my colleague, Miguel Fortes, Dr. Miguel Fortes, Professor Emeritus, University of the Philippines. And that spike that he's holding on to, he was demonstrating that that was all once the middle of a seagrass bed in 1985. And now nothing but green water from the fish pens above that are putting too many nutrients and have clouded the water so much seagrass doesn't grow. Sedimentation from land can also do it. That's what you're seeing on the bottom left here. The kind of white that you see there is sediment that's covering the blades of the seagrass, and things like wasting disease, which is another topic to explore. So as I wrap up here, where do seagrasses go from here? Well, what I want to leave with are these two ideas for you to consider, these two take-home messages. One, absolutely, habitat restoration is a good thing. There's a lot of seagrass that has been lost, but there is a more pressing need to not degrade and destroy the existing seagrass habitat. Why? Well, at the bottom right, you're seeing actually a photograph of a scuba diver. And what you see there are actually transplant experiments. They've put plugs of the seagrass in the bottom of the ocean, and they've covered it with kind of this burlap sack as protection. If you've ever planted plants on land, it takes some work. You have to shovel, you have to dig, you have to plant it, and then you have to take care of it and hope that it survives. Well, this is all done underwater, and our time underwater is limited because we're on scuba, and the time it takes, the money and all that. And my colleagues here in Southern California who work on restoring seagrass beds have just reported back what they found with a big transplant experiment they did. And they only found 18% of their transplants to survive. So it's really expensive, time consuming, and challenging. What's a better solution, or at least a parallel one, is that we should not be destroying it. And that's the photo on the left, that by cautioning people where there's seagrass, giving guidance on how to protect what we already have, is a lot easier than creating something brand new out there and bringing it back. The second point is there's tremendous opportunity to develop novel ways to both monitor seagrass, see how it's doing in terms of its environmental health, its ecosystem health, its role as an indicator species to tell us what's really going out in the ocean. And there's even more benefits of seagrasses in terms of ecosystem services. What things can it give back, such as the pharmaceuticals that I mentioned? And we can explore seagrasses for their diversity of structure. If we're thinking as engineers of their roots and their shoots and their blades and all of these things that are great. How they interact with other species. These are Trypsnoustes, West Indies sea egg urchins, and they actually take the seagrass and use it in different ways. How else can we take seagrass to think about what it can be used for? And something I didn't really get to talk about, but it's of incredible interest to me, is things such as environmental DNA or eDNA, this way to monitor the ocean without having to actually see the organism. And this is something my students and I have been collaborating both on the seagrass world and in the fisheries world. With that, I will wrap up and say thank you very much for listening, and best of luck with the training school and workshop. And I'm happy to answer questions in the live session. Thank you and take care.